My name is Dr. Opanga. I'm a member of Pharmaceutical Society of Kenya, a clinical pharmacist, and a lecturer at the University of Nairobi. So I'm going to talk about original or innovator or brand drugs versus generic drugs. What is an original drug? It is also called an innovator drug, and this is the drug that has been produced and patented, the first type of such a molecule, produced and patented for a specific disease. The original drug has to have a patent for a few years, okay? And then after the patent has expired, then other companies, which are not the parent company, are allowed to produce the same molecule, okay? So this is where a generic comes from. A generic is actually a copy of the original drug. They have the same active ingredient, okay? But the excipients between an originator drug and a generic drug might differ. That's why sometimes if you look at a generic and an original, it's the same active ingredient, it might taste different, it might have a different color, but the action should be the same. A generic and an original drug must be therapeutically equivalent, which means they must be able to perform the same function in the body. They must be able to achieve the same blood concentration in the body. So a generic and an original should be very effective in treating a disease. What about a counterfeit? A counterfeit is basically a fake drug, okay? So the opposite of an original is the fake. So, and any unscrupulous person can actually counterfeit an original or a generic. I want to demystify this fact that sometimes people think a generic medicine is a fake medicine. Generic medicine and counterfeits are totally different things. So I hope that is clear. Then I will talk about the current discussion on whether to put all patients on generic drugs or to put them on innovator drugs. First of all, generics worldwide have been shown to be of a lower cost compared to original drugs. The reason why generics are cheaper is because they have not undergone the rigorous drug discovery process that the originator brand has gone through. Therefore, the costs of production and drug discovery for an originator drug is what makes it more expensive than a generic drug. And that's why they are cheaper. Generics are not cheaper because they are less effective. They are just cheaper because of reduced costs of production compared to the originator drug. Now, who makes a decision on which patient gets an originator or a generic? This should be a multidisciplinary issue. The doctor who is prescribing, the pharmacist, and the patient. The doctor who is prescribing basically will write their prescription in the scientific name. It's not up to the prescriber to decide whether the patient gets a generic or an innovator brand. The pharmacist, having evaluated all the factors of the patient, for example, affordability, socioeconomic status, and the clinical picture, will make a rational decision whether to give this patient a generic or an original. There are some medicines where interchanging either an original or a generic might have some clinically deleterious effects. For example, if we look at anti-epileptic drugs, Some of these drugs have a narrow therapeutic window and complicated pharmacokinetics. So that if you have any slight variation in the blood levels of these drugs, whether in the generic or in the innovator, whether for the generic or for the innovator, then you have clinically significant effects. All right. So it's important that when a patient has been stabilized on a brand, and let's say they are not having any seizures at all, maintain the patient on that brand for this particular group of drugs. If a patient is not stable, then you can try to change. But always look at the clinical picture of the patient. Insurance companies are suggesting that most people should be moved to generics. But what I'd like to say is that it requires clinical judgment and not just blanket movement of people. It requires serious pharmacist input based on what I've been talking about. But generally, generics are actually more cost effective. I mean, they are less costly compared to the original drugs, and most of them do their work well. What we need to be very cautious about is the quality of generics. When generics are introduced in the market, then the Pharmacy and Poisons Board, through the pharmacovigilance program, then needs to follow up with these drugs to ensure that every batch that is produced is of quality, so that our patients are getting quality generics. And that is not to say that brand drugs are bad because they are expensive. Again, if the patient prefers to have a brand, apart from clinical, the clinical issues I've mentioned, the patient can actually have the brand. The other thing I'd like to note is that when you're making these decisions are decisions that are purely professional. It's up to the pharmacist from every point, from procurement of this drug, importation, if it's a locally produced drug, production, and then wholesale, and then sell to the patient. All those steps require a professional. The only professional who can look into this is the pharmacist. Okay? Paraprofessionals are not qualified to be able to handle this. So pharmacists are the ones that follow up. Pharmacists are the ones that will follow up the quality of medication right from production to when they are dispensed to the patient. And if the patient develops any untoward effects, it's then the duty of the pharmacist to intervene and follow up to make sure even the person producing that drug, the manufacturer, is notified of the medication.